My name is Marcos Trujillo. I'm co-director of the BRICLab, Columbia University's Forum on Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and Emerging Markets. We are part of the Center on Global Economic Governance, headed by the great Professor Jan Svejnar. And this is our 4th annual BRICLab conference. We are enormously happy that you're all here. This has been a very important year for BRICS. Presidential elections in Brazil, Modi being elected Prime Minister of India, the tensions involving Russia and Ukraine, and an advancement in terms of the institutional building process for the BRICS, the setting up of a new development bank, the setting up of the Contingency Reserve Arrangement. And that is why we have titled this conference BRICS 2.0. Of course, we're going to look into the performance of BRICS as destinations for portfolio investment, their macroeconomic performance. We're going to also look into how they're helping to shape new global governance. We have 2 extraordinary panels today, terrific lineup of speakers, and I'm going to call the first session to order. To moderate the panel, I call onto stage Fernando Faria, the founder of InnovaBRICS. Please come to the panel. Professor Jan Svejnar, Director of the Center on Global Economic Governance at Columbia University. Otaviano Canuto, Senior Advisor on BRICS economies at the World Bank. Professor Padma Desai, Gladys and Roland Harriman Professor of Comparative Economic Systems here at Columbia. And Arturo Porzecanski, the Distinguished Economist in Residence at American University. I am sure that we're going to have a terrific discussion today, and I therefore give the floor to Fernando Faria. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marcos. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming. Just by way of introduction, I'm Fernando Faria, Brazilian. I founded 3 years ago a community to discuss innovation and investments in emerging markets called InnovaBRICS. Of course, focus on the 5 BRICS markets, and I do include South Africa as my original 5 BRICS markets, although, as we all know, it wasn't in the first 4 BRICS as created by Jim O'Neill in 2001. However, the key message is, in my view, that's the hypothesis that I propose, is innovation can and should be the way forward for emerging markets to leapfrog economic cycles and to build their own growth path, their own way, because they will not have the same tools and the same conditions and the same historic conditions the G7 countries had when they built their growth path. So that's me, but we're not here to talk about me. We're here to talk about the BRICS Development Bank, or the new Development Bank, the CRA, the Contingency Reserve Arrangement, and of course we're here to listen to a stellar panel of authorities on economic development, on BRICS markets, and on economic growth. So without further ado, the rules of engagement, we're going to have 12 to 15-minute opening remarks from each of the speakers, and then we will have a few follow-up questions. I will encourage questions from the floor and also questions from the panelists among yourselves. So please get your thinking hats and put your notes down. Do engage, do interact. I think this is going to be a very good panel in the next 90 minutes. So let me please invite Jan for his opening remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate to be here. I'd like to also join Marcos in welcoming you on behalf of the Center on Global Economic Governance. A number of you come to our events that we organize during the years, and I welcome all those of you who are here for the first time to join us for this annual event and other events that we are organizing. And you can find out more about what we're doing online, so I will not spend too much time describing the center. But let's go directly, in fact, to the issue at hand, which is, as Marcos has mentioned, a terrific year to, in fact, consider the situation. The new development bank, the BRICS Development Bank, as it's called in popular terms, has been launched, has been established. We're dealing with countries that have been rising rapidly. You know, they have more than 40% of the world population, over a quarter of the land mass, and over a quarter of the world GDP is now produced by the BRICS countries. And in fact, if you take it in a medium-term perspective, over the last 20 years or so, 20, 25 years, this ratio, this share of the world GDP has risen dramatically at the expense of Europe and the US. In fact, historically, it's the most rapid change in relative weight in production in the world, location of production in the world, and the BRICS countries are the ones that are the main driving force behind it. So the fact that they've now institutionalized their functioning to the point where they have an existing bank and a lending arrangement is really a major step forward. It should be noted that this is going to be an interesting development in the sense to which this new bank will complement or start substituting some of the activities that the World Bank, IMF, and other development banks are doing. It's also interesting to note that the setup is such that each participant country will be assigned one vote, so it's not in any way weighted. It's a really one country, one vote within the bank, and that nobody has a veto power. So it's a very progressive way in terms of thinking of how the governance of this new institution will be set up compared to the existing institutions. Now, the Contingency Reserve Agreement, or the CRA, is a very important part of this entire establishment. It's means a framework for providing support through liquidity and precautionary instruments in response to actual or potential short-term balance of payments pressures that these countries, as well as other emerging market economies, may encounter. So in some sense, it's really a very broadly based but focused in terms of its activities framework. The basic capital that's being put in, the fund will have $10 billion in paid-in capital, additional $40 billion in terms of paid upon request, and the total initial capital is to be $100 billion. So it's an important step. It's also, I think, essential to realize that it's still a small institution compared to the established institution, but the countries that are starting it are in a way more important, and the setup is more important than Bretton Woods were at the very beginning. So one has to take it in a perspective. It's a starting institution, so comparing it to established institutions is not quite appropriate. I think that the issues that will come, and it's important to think of what some of these issues will be, it's obviously how will the arrangement work. That has not yet been worked out in terms of when will loans be issued, what kind of financial instruments will be used, and that, I think, is something which will test the functioning mechanism, the governance of the bank. But it's really important in a number of other respects. Let me just mention some for the sake of discussion. The world clearly needs more investment, and so having yet another institution is important, right? The idea is to have a new system of governance and provide a new way of thinking about how to provide assistance. This certainly does it. There will be obviously concerns about whether this bank will lend primarily to the founding member countries, to what extent it will in fact lend to others. There will be an issue of the quality of loans. You know, will this bank in fact be willing to take more risky type position in order to help countries that are in need, or will it be putting emphasis on high quality loans and therefore be more conservative at the beginning? So I think these are all issues that have to be established, but they shouldn't, or have to be resolved, but I think they shouldn't mask or hide the fact that it's been a tremendous step forward. And the fact that countries that are as diverse as these countries are have been able and willing to come together and start this initiative and make it be an institutionally based one, I think augurs extremely well for years to come. Let me stop here. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Jan. We're going to open for questions after all the positioning statements. So let's just move swiftly to Otaviano Canuto from the World Bank for his opening remarks.
Thanks, Fernando. And thanks for the invitation. It's always a pleasure to come here to BRICLab. It's always a very rich discussion, and I'm looking forward to our interaction. Let me make 3 points, trying to be complementary to the good presentation that Jan just did. First one is take stock a little bit and see and remember, we have to keep in mind what is the meaning behind the existence of multilateral institutions. A second point that I want to make is how exactly we are in dire need of a readaptation of our framework of a multilateral action. And the third one, I will try to guess a bit what's ahead in the future in terms of the new features of the architecture of these institutions. First point, why these institutions exist. They primarily exist to try to mitigate collective action problems. They provide global public goods that cannot be provided by entirely by, let's say, one or more hegemon countries. That's in a snapshot, what these institutions exist for, whatever be the global collective problem we are thinking of. While at the same time, they embed a reflection of the structure of power, be it depending on the type of institution, economic or financial, however be the way this power is manifested. But it's clear in the sense that if these institutions tend to reflect values and they embed the components of soft power, and when these institutions, even for some occasional dynamics, they rebel and they go astray from that structure, the major powers always have the option to opt out, to stay out. We all have seen, for instance, as a good illustration of that, the difficulties that the UN system has had to face as it moved in a direction that ceased to reflect, to a large extent, the underlying structure of power. Okay, that's the rationale for multilateral institutions. Second, we are facing new types of collective action problems, before which the existing institutions are facing difficulties to be up to. And let me develop a little bit this. According to recent estimates, for instance, presented by McKinsey, which are corroborated by the bank, one may estimate the basic needs in terms of infrastructure investments between now and 2030, something corresponding in the range of $57 to $67 trillion. That is more than the value of the existing infrastructure in the world. And that's higher than, for instance, the investment that has been made in the world in infrastructure, of course. It's substantially higher than the investment that has taken place in the last 20 years. Of this amount, in the range of 67 trillion, roughly 38% correspond to the needs of developing and emerging market economies. without taking into account the specific Millennium Development Goals, and without taking into account the needs regarding adaptation to climate change. That's a low estimate. The World Bank itself, our boss, my boss, has laid out a figure recently of the need of $1 trillion investment per year for the developing countries as a whole. We do have a collective action problem because at the same time, such need of infrastructure investment and therefore finance has not been matched by an appropriate evolution on the supply side of finance. Even worse, things have become even more difficult with respect to long-term investment finance for developing countries. Of course, you might go, well, what this guy talking about? We hear, we read every day about the figures and how the world is awash, is flooded with liquidity. But that's the problem. There is a huge amount of liquidity flushing around, but when it comes to long-term finance, the supply has shrunk. If one looks at if one breaks down the structure of, for instance, long-term finance, debt finance to developing countries, the aggregate figures show an uprise movement of the debt flows. After the blip in 2009, they got back, and one can clearly, I have the figures, a tendency upward, with an important shift in the composition. While bank loans, investment bank loans, have retrenched, it's the kind of, it's the security side, it's the debt finance that has filled the hole. And this, the kind of relationship between the finance side, the supply side, and the investments is typically one of arm's length relationship. Whereas anyone who has had any experience with how infrastructure or other complex long-term investments are made, realize that there is a very important initial stage, one in which both sides work together in order to define details, to simplify projects, to build up what's called project finance in order to make possible the realization of some investments. And we don't have, this role was typically played in several parts of the world until the global crisis by European investment banks. And European investment banks are downsizing, they are, there is a process of leverage still in course. And this gap is there without being filled. Naturally, multilateral development banks could be up to it. But it's the hardship, the difficulties to adjust and to size up and to scale up the existing structure that has impeded to some extent this replacement, this substitution of traditional long-term lenders of the banking type in the current availability of long-term finance in the world. And the reasons for that, you know, are understandable because, as Jan aptly said, regardless of the short-term turmoil and regardless of the difficulties in the associated with the cycle, the fact is that there is a convergence in the world taking place. One can dispute how fast it's going to be. The speed will depend a lot on what developing countries do in terms of quantitative policy and so on. But the backdrop is one that points out statistically, in all regards, the tendency to converge. And as this convergence takes place, naturally, as I said in my first bullet point, the structure of governance of these institutions clash with or at least they face the difficulty of adapting to the change of the scenario associated with the convergence. So we do have, first point, the structure of institutions and the work of these institutions having to embed existing structural powers. That was my first point. Second point, we do have a huge collective action problem at this moment, which is the provision of appropriate long-term supply of finance given the dire needs in terms of infrastructure investments. What leads me to the third point. Naturally, under this circumstance, we are bound to watch a proliferation of institutions, because we have a shifting scenario in terms of distribution of economic power, and there is no single arrangement that can satisfy the interests of each one of these players. China will certainly need to exercise its influence and its view of things in several institutions, as well as the other BRICS. It's not by chance that the final structure of capital is the one as it was designed, a fifth to each one of them. But that's not enough. China creates the Asian Infrastructure Fund, and we are bound to watch the proliferation of many of these institutions. Cooperación Andina de Fomento, which was originally created by the Andean countries, is now called itself Development Bank of Latin America, after Brazil and other major Latin and Argentina stepped in and also made capital provision, and we're going to watch more of these. So there is no way it may look not comfortable from the incumbent's standpoint. I live in Washington, and I have discussions like this very often. And you can feel the discomfort in many people in Washington, because they see all these institutions as a sort of a threat. Instead of understanding that the challenge in the future will be how to create the environment, how to make sure that instead of competing, because it does make sense, it's a lose-lose, the competition among the institutions, we have rules of engagement that may allow for a conversion, for a concerted action, and so on. I guess so far so good. If one looks at the Currency Reserve Arrangement, the provision is there. After a certain point, the country, the taker has to go to the IMF, because it would be a stupidity not to use an existing global public good that can be provided by the existing institutions. On the other hand, when it comes to finance, to having the availability in terms of amount, the World Bank can't, nor can the existing regional development banks. And so I think we should look at this, the creation of the emergence of new institutions, as a way to circumvent the dilemma between, on the one side, the inertia and the difficulties to change the existing structure, and on the other, the collective action problem I was referring to. So it's good news, and we should work towards rules of engagement that may ensure that the response given by these new institutions are along the lines very much well outlined by Jan in his initial conversation.
Thank you, Otaviano. I'm sure we have quite a few questions on these two first initial statements. Let me just go to Padma Desai for her opening remarks. Padma, please.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I want to make a couple of general points following the remarks by my previous colleagues. The two points I would like to make is, why do the BRIC countries need a separate bank, for example? Maybe lending will be increased as a result, more investment funds will be available, but if that is so, aren't the existing institutions, the IMF for instance, in what respect does the IMF fall short of the requirements of the emerging market economies countries and their demand for funds credits when they get into trouble? Is the IMF role inadequate? Is the IMF role biased, maybe tilted somewhat against these emerging market economies? That is one point. The second point is a broader point, is the formation of the BRIC group and the proposed bank, is it sort of directed against the United States, for example? I do Russia, I chase Vladimir Putin, if that is possible. And following that, I mean, is it all directed against United States policy making? Isn't the United States a benign economic hegemon? If the answer is no, if it's not benign, then of course the BRIC countries need their own separate institution framework for dealing with the inadequacy of the United States. So these 2 points. Now the IMF failing short, I have discussed this earlier in this financial crisis book, which was published by Princeton University Press, the Asian financial crisis, 1997, 1998, began in Thailand. But the countries, the Asian economies from Malaysia to Indonesia to Philippines and South Korea, they were very strong. Their macroeconomic indicators were firm. Their inflation rates were low. Their government budgets were almost in balance. But one problem, the problem was that at some stage in the 1990s, early on, a credible argument that the United States Treasury and the IMF, following that, told these countries, Asian economies, open up your economies for short-term capital inflows. You are doing well, your macroeconomic indicators are strong, you can take capital inflows, open up your economies. So they did. Their businesses borrowed on a short-term basis. Their banks did, from Malaysia to South Korea to Indonesia, short-term capital inflows. The Japanese banks were very active as lenders in these groups of countries. But when the crisis began in Thailand, which was the weakest of these economies in terms of the macroeconomic performance, and the Thai balance of payments got into trouble, the dollar went down with regard to the Japanese yen, and the exchange rates of these economies were pegged to the dollar. So there was a fear that their currencies are going to go down. So let us get out. Let us get out of these countries. Because just as investors today are moving out of Russia because the ruble is supposed to decline more and more, that kind of a feeling. And so that's how the Asian crisis began. How did the IMF respond to the crisis? That's what I have discussed in my earlier financial crisis book. And there, I mean, if you see the record of the IMF telling these countries, raise your interest rates so that funds won't flow out. Funds will remain in your economies because your interest rates are high. But for heaven's sake, look at these economies. They are in a state of going into recession, and you are asking them to raise their interest rates? Does that make sense? Another suggestion from the IMF, increase your budget revenues, meaning cut back your budget deficits. Cut back your budget deficits. When economies are going down, you're asking them to cut back budget deficits? Where is Keynes? So Paul Krugman is shouting at the top of his voice. Does that suggestion make sense, asking these economies in the midst of a recession to cut back their budget deficits? That was the IMF. So there is this feeling that the IMF policy making with regard to the interest rate, which I brought out with regard to budget deficit management, are not benign in the midst when countries are facing crisis. So therefore, do we therefore need another institution, which my colleagues brought out some of the details, which can protect better the economic, financial interests of these groups of countries? The second point, is this directed against the United States, for example? The formation of the BRIC group, now led by Russia, China. China would be an enormous contributor to the proposed bank. I mean, just think of it. Chinese People's Bank of China, the Central Bank of China, its dollar reserves in terms of short-term dollar treasuries are in the range of what, about $4 trillion? 4 trillion? These are the reserves of the Central Bank of China. How much can they spend? Just think of it. In beefing up a proposed bank, in providing infrastructure. The new Prime Minister of India invited Xi Jinping, the Prime Minister of China, to the state of Gujarat in India, took him there and told him, Mr. Prime Minister, told the Chinese Prime Minister, we want you to help us with our infrastructure buildup in India. Think of it. I mean, that kind of a proposal between China and India, which have fought a couple of mini wars at the border. So this kind of cooperation. But coming back to the point of, is it directed against the United States, which is not perceived always as a benign hegemon? I mean, this reminds me of an incident, you know, the Federal Reserve monetary policy making, the United States now currently is gradually coming out of a great recession. Our employment is moving up. Our growth rate is projected to move up this year. And the Federal Reserve, therefore, may gradually taper off its bond buying program. So when it buys the bonds, bond prices go up, and interest rates in the US remain low. But if it stops buying bonds, bond prices will go down, and US interest rates will go up. They move in opposite direction. So these emerging market economies, some of them telling the Federal Reserve, when your interest rate goes up, funds flow from our end, from the emerging market economies, to the United States. Think of it. that weakens our currencies. That also weakens our balance of payments. Please, when you taper off this policy, the timing, the speed of the taper off, aren't you paying any attention to the interest of these emerging market economies? We are now a global economy. And I raised this question before a governor of the Federal Reserve Bank in the city. And he looked at me and he said, you know, Professor, do you know the mandate of the Federal Reserve? I said, I do. The mandate of the Federal Reserve is to protect and preserve, I'm making this up, the words, the GDP growth rate of the US economy, the employment rate of the US economy. That was the mandate given to the Federal Reserve when it was established in 1918, right? We don't care about what goes on in emerging market economies. That's what he was telling me, not in so many words, but that was the implication. So don't tell us about how we should reshape our monetary policy. So now, when we talk about the formation of the BRIC Bank, is this directed against United States, say, monetary policy making, which occasionally goes against the interest of emerging market economies? So these are some of the broad questions which I have raised, but we'll follow up probably with some of the details of how these BRIC economies are performing, how the banks, the bank which they are proposing will perform. But right now, I just thought I would raise the issue of whether the IMF was inadequate in its functions of providing help to countries in trouble, whether the United States has ceased to be a benign economic hegemon, and I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Desai. Interesting, you should mention the perception about the United States being no longer a benign force to govern the world economy. There was I think a couple of days ago, I saw a quote attributed to President Putin saying the NDB would provide harassment-free loan and rescue packages to the emerging markets. And I was, of course, very curious on the fallout of that statement, and I'll go back to that point during the panel discussion. Let me introduce the following speaker, Arturo Porzecanski, professor from the American University, for his opening remarks.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jan and Marcos, for inviting me here. And I'm going to provide a very skeptical view of the topic. I think there's a lot of hype and very little substance in the whole BRICS concept and in their behavior and in their potential. It reminds me when I became a professional in the 70s, we had developed countries and underdeveloped countries. But then, you know, it was decided that, yeah, even in those days we had political correctness, that, you know, let's call the underdeveloped developing, you know, give them a chance. So we began to use the word developing and developed. And then in the 80s, a smart fellow in Washington came up with the emerging markets concept, which is even sexier, you know, than developing. And what can I tell you? If you look around, we have underdeveloped countries, we have developing countries, and we have emerging markets. There is a full glory of divergence in countries, and in every region you find them, whether it's in Africa or in South Asia or in Latin America. You know, there's every extreme that you can find. There's every success story, and there's every failure story, and there's every so-so story. So I think that the BRICS as a concept, great marketing tool. Congratulations to O'Neill of Goldman Sachs. Really, what is it once you scratch the surface? You find that Brazil is very different from India, India is very different from Russia, Russia is very different from China, China is very different from South Africa, Turkey, and anybody else that you'd care to throw in. And I'll be elaborating on that. But first of all, yes, size matters. These are large countries in terms of area and sometimes also in terms of population. And for a while, they have been growing rapidly. But past performance is not, as the small print says in the disclaimer, is no guarantee of future results. I mean, think about it, maybe because I'm old enough to remember, but there was a time when the Soviet Union was expected to surpass the United States. That may come news to you if you were young, but if you grow up in the 70s reading Paul Samuelson's textbook, among other things, that was the prediction. Then came Japan, right? Japan was going to beat everybody and so on. Well, that fizzled out. Then, the European Union, was going to challenge successfully the United States, and the greatest since Wonder Bread and all this, and there they are, mired in the mud. Now, I'm not predicting that China is going to have a major recession or financial crisis or something like that, but I think the chances are much greater that they're going to slow down than they're going to accelerate. And the question is how much they will slow down, not if they will slow down. Some of the other countries have already slowed down. Brazil in particular is stagnant now for several years. It's not just 1 year. And it's not because the world economy is in recession. So imagine what would happen if there was a worldwide recession. But even in China, I don't know if you've seen, there's a very interesting recent article in the NBR working papers by Professors Pritchett and Larry Summers that if you work the data on growth rates, the most striking single fact is the reversion to the mean phenomenon. That has much more empirical support than all kinds of other things like the middle income trap and other things. In other words, after a while, it's only a question of when all countries revert to a much lower growth rate than initially recorded. And if you think about, there are many reasons why that might happen. One is a simple arithmetical one. When your GDP is 100 and you increase production by 10, you have 10% growth, 10 divided by 100. But once your GDP has grown rapidly for many years, and say your GDP is 1,000, if you have 10 of additional output, that's just 1% growth. So you need to expand the marginal output being produced a lot more just to keep the growth rate constant, because the denominator is expanding all the time. So the only way that fraction can remain the same is if the numerator expands all the time. And that's just very difficult to sustain. So I would say, we're already seeing cracks in the story of inevitably rapid growth, and watch this space for some reversion to the mean. Now, in terms of do they make sense to talk about, does it make sense to talk about them as a group? I would say it does not. As I said, it's a very convenient, catchy category, and they like it, of course. Now they're, part of their own group and they're being recognized, so it's a great, they love it. But really, look at them closely and you will notice some things. For instance, are they really worried about the global governance issues, and are they coming up with global governance solutions? They're not. Most of them have their eyesight fixed in their own belly and in their own region. Many of them have problems in their borders. I don't need to tell you about Russia with its perimeter, but China has its issues, whether it's in the South China Sea with Japan, with Korea, with other countries. It's always watching the border with India and other borders further east. India has its own issues with Pakistan, with China, et cetera, rivalries and so on and so forth. And while Brazil has peaceful relations with all its neighbors and there are no border demarcation issues, I don't foresee Brazil taking a bite out of any other one's territory. Regional issues preoccupy the authorities so much more than global issues. If something's not going right in Bolivia or in Paraguay, that gets higher priority than if something's going wrong in Germany, in Japan, or in Turkey. So I think that they're just not thinking big. And one of the reasons is because they have serious problems at home of all kinds, social, political, economic challenges, and so on. And they have serious issues along their borders and in their own region. So they tend to think regionally, not globally. And we may question whether that's a contribution to knowledge and governance, but they're not coming up with the big ideas in terms of global governance. They don't replace the global governance institutions that we have in terms of thought, and definitely not in terms of action. Look at how they've reacted to the invasion of Ukraine. I mean, here are the countries that are always saying, oh, we believe in territorial integrity, we believe in non-intervention, don't come tell us what to do. And then, when one of their guys does what they do, I didn't see that. I didn't see that, We had it even in South America. Chavez was intervening in various ways, financially, politically, militarily, in various ways, sometimes under the radar in its neighboring countries. And did we ever see Brazil really standing up and telling Chavez to shut up? No, it was the King of Spain who did it. Mostly they worked, I don't want to say that mostly they worked. They don't like to speak loudly and carry a big stick. They mostly worked the hallways and the back ways to try to contain the Chavez onslaught. But still, I think the world needs people who will stand up and be counted. And I don't expect that we can expect the BRICS countries to be those kinds of people. In terms of new ideas on global governance, as I mentioned, I could give several examples, whether it regards to trade arrangements or financial arrangements. They're not thinking big. They're not thinking of a better WTO or a better IMF or a better World Bank or a better what have you. They're just thinking of, oh, why don't we cut and paste something, that we run, and maybe we can set a good example, but probably not. Let me talk about the BRICS Bank and the contingent facility to conclude. So banks like the BRICS, we've had many. Otaviano mentioned in Latin America, we have several regional development banks. He mentioned the CAF, which has been rebranded. We have the Andean Reserve Fund. We have Central American and Caribbean development banks. It's not just the inter-American development banks. And they have played a role, like the Andean Reserve Fund. They make money lending to Ecuador. Nobody else wants to lend to Ecuador, so they make money lending to Ecuador and pay their shareholders that way. And, they all play some kind of a role, but none of them displace the global governance institutions. I think by definition, if you have a narrow mandate, a narrow concept, a narrow set of funding, et cetera, you're not going to change the world. You may change some corner of the world, but you're not going to change the world, and even that, I would say. You may know that Chavez and company, they wanted to set up a Bank of the South. That went nowhere. And for very good reasons, because countries like Brazil and others wanted to see the substance of it. And there was not going to be quality control. There was not going to be good management. There was not going to be conditionality. There wasn't going to be any. So that Bank of the South was going to be, a laughable money-losing institution. So in the end, it wasn't canceled, but it just never took off. The BRICS Bank is going to take off. Don't get me wrong, because these are more serious partners and they're putting up some serious money. But in the bigger context, it's not enough. Besides, I have a cynical view, not just a skeptical view. The BRICS Bank is supposed to support infrastructure projects. What would a cynical person say? This is just one big front for the Chinese construction companies and the Brazilian construction companies to win mandates all over the world and, have the BRICS Bank pay for it. And hopefully countries and projects that are mismanaged, won't dare to default, because they wouldn't mind defaulting to a construction company. They've done that many times. But you wouldn't want to default to the, BRICS Bank and offend the big boys, in your neighborhood. So that's my cynical view. There's plenty of infrastructure needs. They're not in China. China needs to export all its construction expertise. And curiously, there's plenty of infrastructure needs in India and in Brazil and in Russia and so on. But as I say, I think in practice, it's a different agenda. It's not changing the world or building bridges. It's getting contracts. And also the issue of insufficient scale. How does a development bank work? You get governments to put in some paid-in capital, a fraction of the total that they've pledged. In this case, I think it's 10 billion out of the pledge, 100 billion. And, you don't go anywhere by just lending out $10 billion. That's just a drop in the bucket. So what you do is you go out and borrow, you raise money in the capital markets, and then you can leverage that 10 billion, and that's how you become a big player in that space. It's called leverage. Of course, if Citibank does it, no, you're not supposed to do that. But if you're a development institution, go ahead, borrow a lot and lend it out. But that's where, of course, investors come in and the rating agencies come in and so on. Unless you have good projects to show, projects that will be paid back on time, they're not going to give you a good rating. And if they don't give you a AAA rating, you're not going to be able to sell them bonds. So since the essence of any of these institutions is to borrow in order to leverage the paid-in capital, they're going to have to find projects that will get paid back. And I think that will turn to induce some discipline and or, as I mentioned before, it will tend to push the borrowers into giving priority to paying this bank because they don't want to offend their shareholders and they don't want to bring the bank down vis-a-vis the markets and so forth. So I think it'll be hard for them to come up with a lot of good projects. Infrastructure is a minefield. Nobody, especially in the developing world, nobody wants to pay for water. Nobody wants to pay for electricity. Nobody wants to pay for roads. They think it's, someplace in the Human Rights Charter. And if that's how you're going to build infrastructure, you're not going to get paid back. And finally, the contingent facility. In this case, the idea is borrowed, I think, from the Chiang Mai initiative. After the Asian financial crisis, a bunch of the Asian countries got together and they pledged to each other that, if ever there was trouble, you could come and borrow from each other. We'll, forget about the IMF, come here. After all, the IMF doesn't know what it's doing. So, we know what it's doing. So how was the Chiang Mai Initiative facility set up, and how was this contingency facility set up? Well, if you read through the fine print, if you are a member of the facility and you want to access it because all of a sudden there's a problem, say the Fed that doesn't care about you and they raised rates a little too rapidly and shook up the markets, and now nobody wants to invest in your, questionable economy, and you go to the facility, if you want some money, yes, you can borrow from the facility. If you want a lot of money, you have to go to the IMF and have an IMF program. Then we'll give you the money. So are they replacing the IMF? No. They're piggybacking on the IMF. So please, let's cut through the hype and look at what is really happening in the BRICS. Thank you.
Thank you, Arturo. So we have just about half an hour to complete this session. I will open to the floor for your questions. Please try and keep them concise so we can, leverage all this brain power we have this on the panel. Let me just kick off while you get your questions jotted down. If I can, of all the notes I made, draw a thread between all the four positioning statements, skepticism came out very strong. We have, of course, Arturo very strongly mentioning that, but also when Padma mentioned, was this born out of the IMF's failing? What was this one of the biggest reasons for the new development bank to being created? Jan mentioned it hasn't been tested, and is it going to, are we keeping this skeptical view until it has been tested? And Otaviano mentioned, is this proliferation good or bad? We're having all these development banks. And of course, Jim O'Neill, and I'm a member of Chatham House, so there was a lecture a couple of months ago, and when he mentioned he was reflecting back on when he created BRICS as an economic thesis, not as a political group. And he said, before the announcement of the BRICS Development Bank, he was saying, they don't seem to agree on much. Are they really going to agree on like substantial investments and governance and how do, for example, the crisis in Crimea or like more bigger issues in terms of global governance and international relations? So I think skepticism is a big theme. Otaviano.
I disagree with that in the following sense. I wasn't skeptical. My point is the following. We are inventing a question that is wrong, that is inappropriate, and then we respond to the question that we formulate by saying, well, they're going to fail. My point is that these institutions cannot be measured, analyzed, as if they have been created to replace the existing institutions. Mm-hmm. That's a Washington-centered view that is simply out of the point. It only demonstrates the inability of the people here to understand what's at stake. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's a practical, an attempt to resolve a practical need. And I disagree in one respect with Arturo, which is the following. Arturo spoke in the way, well, they're going to fail because they're not a dual replacement of existing institutions. The fact that the reserve arrangement had the IMF there, it's a symbol that it's a complement. And it's a complement given the difficulty to solve the current collective action problem. Now, I work at the World Bank. I've been a vice president there. I've been a vice president at the IDB. I've been 10 years working on this. It's hard simply to increase the ability of these banks to, and it's not, as Arturo said, it's not the money that they lend directly. It's the crowding in, is the syndicated lending, is the capture of money through the markets and so on. And the reform at the IMF is stuck. It was hard to have a minor reform. It is there pending in the US Congress since then, since 2008. So these countries are creating tentative solutions to face concrete problems. So don't ask this question, are they trying to replace? No, it's a stupid question.
Yeah, so my question was actually for the panel, was there a need? You already mentioned, yes, there was. or was it a political statement more than an actual technical need for a new instrument? So, Jan.
Yeah, no, I think it was both. I think there is no doubt that there is a political motivation, in part engendered by the governing rules in the existing institutions, and these new and rapidly growing countries have felt for a while that the governance rules are not being adjusted fast enough. They are being adjusted, but in their view fast enough. But I think there is also a possibility that they may provide a significant amount more of capital than they have so far. I mean, this is clearly inadequate. All these points that were made that this is so far limited are correct. But as I was stressing at the beginning, every institution that starts is starting from a relatively small scale. And if they do provide much more, then it's going to be indeed a complement that will be very important. A substitute perhaps in terms of how we may think of governance, which is good also for the debate and discussion how these big institutions should be run, but I think they can have a big impact. I agree with Arturo, they are very heterogeneous. I mentioned that, and in some sense it's a wonder that they have actually come together, because apart from the sort of size and the fact that they've been at different periods, some of them all the time in the last 30 years, like China growing rapidly, they don't have that much in common. But the fact that they're willing to come together and that they have demonstrated by starting an institution, and if they don't want to lose their face too much, they will nurture it and make it grow, that I think is a sign that we may expect with some degree of probability that this will become gradually a more important institution, and therefore also will have a major effect. The political diversity that Padma mentions, I think, is a big issue. That is going to be haunting them, and they will have to somehow feel about resolving it somehow. Yeah.
Padma, I have a note here saying during your comments, was the New Development Bank an answer to a need to protect emerging markets from this newly globally subscribed view that the U.S. has become not necessarily no longer a benign force in economic governance? So you would agree that it was because of a need as opposed to a political fabrication of sorts, the creation of the new bank?
Well, I was thinking about China-Russia interaction in the context of the proposed bank. And I think there's some very interesting back and forth. China is wanting to, almost planning to buy billions of dollars worth of energy from Russia. Russia is one of the world's largest producers of natural gas and oil. And Russia will buy consumers' goods from China. How will the payment be made? What will they pay each other? Will Russia pay China in renminbi and China pay Russia in rubles? Is that the arrangement? That's what the Russian side seems to be proposing. And what is the idea there? You want to replace the dollar as the currency in payment of bilateral trade. Does that make sense? Will that work? I mean, after all, the price of most commodities, oil, aluminum, nickel, etc., it's all denominated in world markets in dollars, right? In the 1960s, under Nehru, Khrushchev, Brezhnev, and beyond in the 70s, India and Russia tried to settle their bilateral trade in rupees and rubles. Just think of it. And there was a massive accumulation of rubles or rupees on the Russian side or whatever. And it didn't work. It was then given up. So my question then would be to ask these Russian policymakers, just get off this desire to sort of wanting to replace the dollar as the currency of pricing, as the reserve currency, and don't think of settling your your trade in terms of your own currencies. It doesn't make sense to me.
Thank you. Arturo, any comments in defense?
So just to make clear, I'm not predicting the failure of the BRIC Bank or the contingent facility, or that the major countries that belong to the BRICS are going to, going to a recession or whatever. I'm just saying, don't just buy the hype. There are real problems, there are real issues, and you can't just complement, never mind replace the existence global economic and financial governance institutions that easily. It's not so easily done. So for instance, the IMF. The IMF has become kinder and gentler since the Asian crisis. They learned a lesson or two. Now, I don't think if a country has a balance of payments crisis, I don't think they're going to tell them to lower interest rates or to, run a bigger budget deficit. I'm not sure that they're there yet, but they've certainly, learned some lessons. Now, you want to improve the IMF? Then where are your ideas? But, or you don't like the way the Fed doesn't care about the rest of the world? Okay, what are your ideas for that? You can't have it both ways. When the Fed has a loose monetary policy, and it floods the market with liquidity as it did, and interest rates come down, and then all this liquidity is looking for a new home, and China says, I don't want it, and it ends up in places like Brazil or South Africa or Turkey, then those governments have complained, hey, you can't do that to us, you're flooding us with liquidity, our currencies are appreciating, you can't do that to us. When the Fed says, okay, you don't like it, we've decided we don't like it either. We're going to stop buying bonds. In fact, they've done that already. And, the prospect is interest rates will go up. What are the BRICS saying? No, you can't do that to us, Be careful. We're made of fragile glass, Be careful how you handle us. Please don't do this. But, man up. I mean, really, you can't have it both ways. You want to replace the Fed? Go ahead, do it like you were saying. You can't replace the Fed, you can't replace the dollar. So if you start along those lines, you're not going to get very far. You just have to adjust your economy and your economic policies and so on, so you can withstand the impact of whether it's lower Fed rates or higher Fed rates. That's what you have to do. And we know how to do that, minimizing currency mismatches, flexibilizing the exchange rate regime, et cetera, et cetera. So my point is these BRICS are not making contributions to improving global governance. And I think that the steps that they're taking to complement the global governance tend to undermine it. It's a little bit like termites in the system. It's a little bit like, the spaghetti bowls. We'd have them in trade. We now have them in finance as well. Thank you.
I believe there was a question
right there,
from this side.
Right there, yeah.
Yep. I can't see this person, but
yeah,
please feel free. Keep it short and direct to one of the speakers, please, or to the whole panel if you wish.
Hi. I would like to quote two people in response to some of the cynicism that was expressed and the skepticism about the BRICS. Paul Krugman in '94 said in an article on the myths of Asia's miracle, from the perspective of the year 2010, current projections of Asian supremacy extrapolated from recent trends may well look almost as silly as the 1960s vintage forecasts of Soviet industrial supremacy did from the perspective of the Brezhnev years. So that's just to put in perspective somewhat that we may be wrong about being cynical about the longer-term trends. And then in response to the MBR article of Pritchett and Summers about growth rates reversing to the mean, Danny Kwa wrote just a couple of days ago a fantastic blog about the law of averages misinforming. He said, across all of recorded history, 99% of humanity has never invented a single thing. The great majority of humanity over the last 7 million years provides a completely misleading guide to what is possible. This is why, against all odds, every nation exhorts its people to be creative and innovative. So the average is not an indicator of what is possible. So yes, China may not be able to grow at more than 6% a year going forward, but that's not because of the law of averages. It's because of other reasons, most likely. Thank you.
Thank you. Was there any reaction from yeah?
Taking the chance that Philip referred to inequality, it's also another point that I'd like to dispute, Arturo. The issue is not growth rates, it's size of the economies. And inequality, among many, I myself did an exercise some years ago, and it's been replicated, showing that despite the cyclical convergence, there's no such a thing as decoupling of emerging markets from the advanced economies. But one can note a decoupling of the trend. The trend has lowered in the last few years, but still there is an edge. The mechanics, it's mechanic. The size of the developing world will grow relative to advanced economies. And that's accompanying a rise in per capita income. So as far as the distribution of the global GDP, the process is still there. It has not been reversed, although in the cycle. And I will take the chance as well to corroborate what Arturo said about the change in the IMF. And by the way, Professor, we are very proud, Philip and I, we are a World Banker, that at that time we had Professor Stiglitz as our chief economist bashing the IMF, right? So the World Bank was on the right side. And now he's a novel and a professor in Columbia, so no more appropriate. But the truth is, if one looks at the action of the IMF in Europe, it looks like it has been the more benign of the three of the Troika, right? So,
I believe we have other questions, please.
I wonder if you could, and I'm not sure who to address it to, I'll open it to the panel. If you could talk about what plan, if any, is there ever to pay any of this money back? It seems that we are always reading about this country or that country or our own country, $18 trillion in debt going to 20, and it seems like we can arrest a Bernard Madoff for his Ponzi scheme, but we could always float more bonds to help pay the interest on the old bonds. And you never hear any plan that somewhere along the line, this money will be repaid, and how many times countries have defaulted on the debt or inflated it away. So where does this all go in that respect?
Any takers?
Well, I would just point out that it's not as dire always as you're describing. I mean, take the US debt after World War II, huge debt, right? And 20 years later, it was whittled down to a relatively small amount, in part because of rapid economic growth, large part because of rapid economic growth. So, you know, you don't have the dire picture that all countries always default and are unable to handle large debt. Another example, Japan has one of the largest debts relative to GDP, but because it's internal, it's in the family, so to speak, the financial markets have not reacted as negatively to it as they have to others. So the picture is very diverse and not just as negative as looks at first sight, just looking at the aggregate numbers.
Yeah. Your question kind of reflected sort of a prejudice that non-advanced economies have a propensity to default, which is not necessarily the case.
On that side now?
Cynthia Roberts. Since the last piece I wrote was called Why the BRICS Matter, the last piece I wrote on the BRICS, I think my question will be mostly on the economic side, but let me make one quick comment on the political side. I think we already have good evidence that the BRICS, despite their differences, collaborate, and not directly as a frontal attack on the US, but in terms of getting exactly the double standards and the informal power, not just the formal changes in global governance institutions. I'll just cite two examples of this, not just the creation of the BRICS Bank, But the fact before that, the BRICS, despite their very different political regimes and economic structures, and despite the fact that all of them were being hurt by Chinese currency manipulation, nonetheless supported China in agreeing not to call against, punish China for doing this. That was informally collaborated, and BRICS countries have attested to that. And secondly, we see it in the sanctions against Russia. Not one of them will join the US, even though Washington has gone to all of these capitals, pushed hard for China and India to join. So they're standing up to the US indirectly, not frontally, and showing that indirectly they can improve their collaboration. And Padma, on your point, I think they're actually testing the Chinese proposition. How much can you do for us? India would love a seat, along with Brazil, on the Security Council. Probably won't get it, but they'd like one. They'd like the infrastructure spending by China. So there's a test. What can you do for us if we support you in these backdoor deals? And after all, backdoor deals is what the United States has done since Bretton Woods. My question, though, is on the economic side of their collaboration. The BRICS Bank went forward despite most people thinking it wouldn't, which is yet another step forward. And the big question for me is this conditionality question. How, to what extent, as Jan pointed out at the beginning, and some of you also touched on, will these loans be serious, conservative, and to what extent will they have a political component? So far, our evidence is that in other respects, China really wants to get its money back when it loans money, and the reliance on the IMF suggests that they do want that kind of capacity. But I'd like to press you a little bit further if there's perhaps more you know from the World Bank collaboration with these countries or private sector collaboration, whether there's an indication that on the political side, they may be tempted to look the other way, as sometimes, of course, the United States has. Russia was once too big to fail. Now we want to punish Russia. And whether the economic, more conservative factors will prevail or not. If you could comment further. Thank you.
Okay. So just summarize your questions about conditionality and whether it will be slightly more flexible than we've seen so far.
Right. Exactly. What the BRICS Bank is likely to do going forward. Thank you.
Well, I'll start, but I think here we really just don't know. So my guess, given what's happened so far, is that they will actually be fairly orthodox in that. But I could see them also taking initiative and challenging or asking the IMF to join them in joint activities and possibly having some highly visible cases where they will help save a country that otherwise might not get the aid right away. But overall, I think they just cannot afford to go way out of line simply in order to keep their rating, get the rating, maintain it, and so on and so forth.
Even though they're creating their own rating agencies, which I'm sure you've also noticed. True. But I think
especially at a starting point, unless they really want to deviate, which I'm not ruling out, that they may want to deviate in a major way, I would bet that they will want to get approval by the existing rating agencies as well.
Thank you.
If I may just add, we know from experience how not to do it. And I'm referring to the African Development Bank. Some of you may know when it was initially founded, the African countries say, we want our own bank, and we don't want any of the colonial powers as shareholders, and we don't want them to tell us what to do. We want to do it ourselves. So in the beginning, the African Development Bank was only for Africans, and guess what? They almost went bankrupt because if you have a society of poor countries, how much are you going to lend out of that? This is not the case in the BRICS, but anyway. But then there was a whole issue of lending standards. There were practically no lending standards. Whatever governments asked for from the African Development Bank, they got. Then they started not to pay it, and the whole thing spiraled out of control. And in the end, the African Development Bank shareholders realized that they needed help, so they opened the bank up to the former colonial powers. Welcome your money, welcome your management expertise, and so on. And today's African Development Bank is a completely changed institution. I hope that the BRICS Bank won't repeat the African Development Bank Mark I experience.
One thing, because I think this is important. You guys talk about conditionality in abstract. There are several types of conditionalities. Fiduciary conditionality, you may take for granted, because the bank will need to have the money back. Otherwise, it's bankrupt for all the reasons that Arturo has established. Whereas with respect to other kinds of conditionalities, that's to be seen. Arturo mentioned, well, the bank is to convey, to be a vehicle for the Chinese and Brazilians and so on. It's true. But we have to look at who does the construction and so on for the World Bank as well, right? And sometimes there is a double standard. I will give an example. For a certain moment, the World Bank was prohibited to lend to South Africa in a coal mining project. And the major actor was the US. Now, ask for climate change reasons. Now let me ask you, is this a country that does what it needs? No, it needs to use coal. So there are double standards, which is natural because if one goes to the World Bank, it's because needs, so it has to comply with. So in this sense, there will be difference with respect, probably environment, conditionalities, resettlement, and so on. But fiduciary, it's going to be fun.
On the topic of conditions, I just want to announce that I was granted 10 additional minutes for this panel under the condition that the following questions should be short and concise so we can go through all the questions. So let's go to the left side, please.
Hi, Daniel Goldman. Thank you very much for an excellent discussion. A question for Dr. Canuto. Although there were some successes associated with the early waves of infrastructure financing by the MDBs, there were also massive cost overruns, high levels of environmental damage, high incidences of corruption, and devastating resettlement plans. Do you think that this new wave of infrastructure financing should emphasize traditional infrastructure rather than off-grid high-tech solutions such as renewable energy, telemedicine, water purification, and other mobile technologies? And if so, how can we avoid the pitfalls of the earlier types of infrastructure financing?
Let's take another one. You're going to take notes? Yes, please.
I'd like to know your opinion about the efforts to enforce the yuan to break the monopoly of the dollar in the global currency. I'd like to know if you think that the new development bank would help to reinforce this trend. And just for the fact that we are discussing it, isn't it already a sign that the BRICS can effectively influence the world order somehow to fulfill their desire to be better placed in the international scenario? Thank you.
Let's tackle these two. Would you like to, Canuto, to start with the infrastructure project question?
Yeah, certainly so. One can be upbeat in the sense that these countries are not stupid, right? And if there are alternatives, technological alternatives, that can provide better answers to the needs, why not? Will there be any bias impeding the procurement, some kind of procurement bias, impeding these countries to use the best technology available? The answer to this question is an extension of the question made with respect to the countries individually. To the extent that these countries are protective of their production of infrastructure-related items, this will be transmitted to the bank. I'm less upbeat in that regard because, as I'm a liberal, I feel very uncomfortable with the prevailing levels of protection, including in the case of my own country, Brazil. But certainly, the latest option, possibly if they are available, it will be. What needs to be done is the investment, right? The worst scenario is not doing anything. On the EU one, I would give that to Arturo.
On the dollar, So I'm not sure that the BRICS are out to dethrone the dollar. Because, as I was saying, how do you improve global economic or financial governance? You have to come up with a better idea than the one that has been come up with to date. So if you want to dethrone the dollar, you have to come up with a better currency. And I just don't see any of the members of the BRICS either coming up with a better currency or really wanting to internationalize that currency to the fullest extent necessary to replace an easily tradable currency like sterling or euro or yen or the dollar. You know, these are countries that have capital controls. These are countries that don't exactly want to just let anybody use their currencies, including especially to speculate against them, and so on and so forth. So, like I was saying with the view towards the Fed, you can't have it both ways. If you're going to complain about the dollar, come up with something better. But I just don't see, even though certainly China is trying to internationalize the yuan, that they're going to get very far. But let them try, and let them try the right way, not by pulling down the dollar, but by contributing better currencies to the mix.
Thank you. Next one, left.
This is short and sweet. My name is Pedro Perez Ortiz. I'm a college graduate, and I have various master's degrees, none of them from Colombia. I'm just a neighbor of Colombia, which piggyback on all the presentations. This is just a comment. Agreeing with the positive tone of the panel. It's not a wall, it's just a brick. It's just a brick. And in honoring the glorious absent Argentinian country that I gather they even want to bother to apply for when they're looking for members. No un ladrillo, es un ladrillo, no es una muralla.
Is it a Chinese brick or a Chinese wall, or no? Let's go here on the right side, please.
Hi, I'm Zengi. I'm from South Africa, but I live here now. My question is more concerned about this issue about whether or not BRICS will or will not work, and whether these countries, this club of countries, whether they have much in common enough to work together successfully. And I just wanted to know whether, is it possible that, given that these countries clearly have different priorities to the kind of priorities that the West would advance, given, for example, in the case of Crimea, they very clearly have very different priorities. Hence, maybe we haven't heard them speak out as loudly as the West has. Could our anxiety about BRICS be less about will they work and more a concern that maybe if they do work, what would it mean for a club that prioritizes things that are so vastly different to the West mean for the way global governance could work?
Will they work?
Why not? Again, these things will work if and when these countries find common interests that can materialize. Apparently, the BRICS Bank, the New Development Bank, is such an example. That's it. Beyond that, who's aspiring, who's waiting, expecting something else? Then this creation of this audience, see? Oh, well, what's next? No, right. And interestingly, you guys don't use the same yardstick to evaluate the G7. I will give an example. After all that has happened with Ukraine and Russia, I never heard a line in the US talking about relieving the export ban on shale gas to Europe to help Europe to cope with Russian case. Nonetheless, I don't hear any headlines complaining, showing this as an example of lack of collaboration among G7 countries. So don't apply double standards to evaluate G7 coordination with what happens with the BRICS.
I was going to ask, because I'm based in London, and I see, like, pretty much every day being close to Brussels and what happens in the European Union. It doesn't look like a very functional forum for policymaking. And as you question and argue, would BRICS be anyhow dysfunctional as a group? I don't see a global benchmark that would say, you know, this is it, we can't achieve that, because that isn't the most functional government policy platform either. Let's go that to the left side. We have 5 minutes left, so laser beam questions, please.
Okay, my name's Suzanne Clevey. I work with the Executive Intelligence Review. We're enormously enthusiastic about the potential of the BRICS. Helga LaRouche, who is the wife of our editor, was one of the people who proposed the Silk Road projects altogether, which has now been a critical part of this concept. My question to some, you know, is this. Professor Caputo talked about whether or not the BRICS would be seen as a threat to the Western banks, and this problem of liquidity, which is massive, being heavily associated with debt and not with investment into anything that actually represents physical production. You talk about the question of whether the West has been benign, or the United States in particular. I think it's clear that the U.S. has been completely not benign, whether it's the question of the sanctions or the vulture funds in Argentina, or even the recent cancellation of the rail deal with Mexico. So you have a confrontation. I would say that the situation for the American population has not been benign under the pressure coming from these financial institutions. I mean, the lack of infrastructure in the U.S. is absolutely massive. Now, my question is basically this. It seems to me what we're dealing with the BRICS is a completely different conception of economics. Modi, for instance, Prime Minister Modi, talked extensively about the fact that 65% of their population is under the age of 35. He has just recently, yesterday, said they want to create 1 million jobs per month for 10 years and create entirely new cities and go from the space program into this development of a young population, which has tremendous potential for development for the world. My question is, how would we get the U.S. to actually join this different conception? I mean, we have we've endorsed the idea of a Glass-Steagall initiative in the United States, that we actually get the United States back to the idea of investment in physical production and infrastructure, and we deal with the debt crisis here by shutting down what really has been a pernicious operation being run through the too big to fail banks. My question is, how would this operate from the United States joining it rather than a confrontation?
Right. Let me just go back here. We tackle these two questions.
Hi, good morning. Abhijit, I work in the space of cross-border transactions, cross-border financing for energy. And I'm sure we're going to be discussing more about fund flow and financing in the next panel. But I'm just going to have a quick question, because there was a mention about fund flow. Ms. Desai mentioned about the fact that quantitative easing, the relaxation of it, could actually change the fund flow direction. My question was, do you really think that a macroeconomic policy change for, say, in one developed country like the US has the potential to kind of disrupt this fund flow, which typically is from countries which lower interest rates to countries which are higher interest rates? Don't you think that that delta, or the arbitrage, or the carry trades, as it's called, will still exist? Because there is going to be negative backlashes with an increased interest rate here, which will in turn increase the regional interest rates, which means there's going to be more fund flow. So it's more concerning about that particular point you just made. Thanks.
The last one, and then we cover these three, and then we wrap up the panel. Please, question?
My question is just related to the financing of infrastructure and how much the problem is the ability to finance versus policies in certain countries. And one thing, I think China has the least investment needs, in the sense that it has the least trouble attracting investment funds or mobilizing investment resources. But to what degree is that relative to certain undemocratic qualities of its society, namely the ability to make land acquisitions? Environmental concerns can be negotiated in a way that might not be as easily negotiated in Brazil or India. And I guess that, I'm wondering if it's as much a question of being able to mobilize the resources or dealing with actual problems that are part of a democracy.
Okay, so will the United States join, compete, or ignore? interest rates, and I think if I understood correctly, is what makes the BRICS countries an interesting investment destination. Anyone? We have probably 3 minutes left.
One point. The World Bank issues bonds with interest rates close to the Fed. And that comes from two things. On the one hand, the implicit guarantee given through the capital that is not paid in, and on the other side, the seniority of the World Bank loans to the countries. This BRICS Bank will probably, if it beyond the paid-in capital, if the management of the use of the lending space is such that it doesn't jeopardize the sustainability, together with the seniority of the loans, there is no reason why these banks exactly are able to issue bonds close to the best rating among the countries. So the issue of the interest rates and what's going to happen will affect the bank operation in the same way that it will affect the best ranked countries of these. One final thing, it's Professor Padma Desai observed that no other countries are taking over like Russia did in the case of Ukraine. But one thought, if Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay got together, we would hold 9 World Cups, right?
So
just a dream.
That's a good rating.
That's a good closing remark. Arturo, do you have a
just a quick thing. So I don't think it's a U.S. versus BRICS. The BRICS, I think, realize that a lot of the forums that are already established, including World Bank, IMF, Asian Development Bank, WTO, etc., are useful. I think that they're not creating these and they're going to quit the others. It's not an us versus them. They just want, and I can understand it, they just want a few institutions where they're the boss, where it's either a Chinese, an Indian, a Russian, or a Brazilian who's the president, and it's headquartered in one of those countries, and it's just 4 of us. We don't have to worry about a European becoming the president. We don't have to worry about basing this in Washington. They just want to have that. Okay, you want to have not an international competition for talent, but just, a rigged game of 4, go ahead, have it. And secondly, with regard to the financial markets will go on doing what they're doing. The carry trade will go on. Whichever country, currency you fund yourself will change over time. There'll always be somebody with low interest rates and somebody with high yields, and somebody always will try to, borrow low and buy high, go where the yields are high. So I think life will go on. This doesn't threaten it. There are plenty of investment opportunities. And I don't think any of these BRICS initiatives will really change the international financial landscape.
Professor Desai, your final thoughts?
Well, I agree with you that let us look at it. When it comes to lending, borrowing, how much of it takes place across countries in the global economy as a result of private sector, corporate financiers, private sector banks, a whole lot of it, a preponderant amount of investment activity is financed by private sectors, private banks. And I think these roles of even International Monetary Fund and the World Bank and this new bank proposed by the BRIC countries is going to be very limited. I have enormous faith in private sector, not only here in the United States and Europe, but in Asia, China, India, and Latin America, and elsewhere, forging ahead with borrowing, lending, and financing investment activity. These are very small actors, the BRIC Bank and the World Bank and IMF. That's my final view.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, Jan, Otaviano, Padma, Arturo, and Fernando have contributed greatly to enlighten our understanding of the present and the future of BRICS. Let's thank them with a round of applause.